At the U.S.-Mexico border, floodlights cut through the desert night as Frank Gravel Dawson rolled his battered Peterbilt into inspection. What should have been paperwork and a wave-through turned ugly when two corrupt cops smelled blood in the water and cash in his pockets. Frank Dawson wasn't your typical trucker. For 43 years, he had lived behind the wheel. A road veteran who once braved black ice and broken bones to keep his promise to deliver. Known across highways as a man who never quit, his grit was legend among those who knew the road's dangers. When the Border Patrol tried to strip him of his dignity, threatening to impound his rig and even steal his late wife's ring, they had no idea they were about to face warriors from another world. Chuck Norris stepped forward. Steven Seagal closed in. What began as a shakedown had just become a battlefield. What started as a crooked midnight stop would erupt into a clash that spread across cameras, headlines, and memory. The border crossing would never forget the night two icons turned corruption into a fight for justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The night spread across the desert like spilled ink, broken only by the harsh white floodlights that carved the U.S.-Mexico border crossing out of the darkness. Frank Gravel Dawson squinted against the glare, his leathered hands gripping the worn steering wheel of his 18-wheeler. The truck, a '98 Peterbilt he called Rosie after his late wife, groaned beneath him, the engine ticking over like an old heart that had seen too many miles. "Almost there, girl," Frank whispered, his voice a rasp of sandpaper across metal. The nickname Gravel had stuck after 30 years of chain, smoking and shouting over diesel engines, though he'd quit the cigarettes after Rose passed. Too late to save her. But maybe not too late for him. He eased Rosie into the line for commercial vehicles, watching as officers methodically worked their way through the queue ahead. Frank fished in his breast pocket for his paperwork, all in order, like always. 43 years on the road, and he'd never once been cited for improper documentation. The crossing was unusually quiet tonight. A sparse collection of travelers waited in their respective lanes. Families in weathered sedans, young couples in rental cars, migrant workers with anxious eyes. Frank watched them in his side mirrors, recognizing the particular brand of weariness that settles into travelers at border checkpoints, that mixture of impatience and caution, the paradoxical desire to be noticed and overlooked simultaneously. Behind the inspection booths, two Border Patrol officers leaned against a cruiser, their heads bent together in conversation. One tall with broad shoulders and a buzz-cut gestured toward the truck lane with a smirk. The second, younger, with nervous eyes, nodded eagerly. Even from a distance, Frank recognized the predatory assessment in their posture. "Don't like the look of that," he muttered, his grip tightening on Rosie's wheel. Officer Victor Hale straightened his uniform, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve as he watched the ancient Peterbilt roll forward. "There's our golden ticket, Riker," he said, elbowing his younger partner. "Old man, old truck. Bet he's got cash stashed somewhere. They always do." Officer Riker nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "You think he's hauling anything?" Hale's laugh was sharp. "Does it matter? Look at him, lone wolf, no company logos. Probably an owner-operator trying to make one last run before that rust bucket falls apart. Easy pickings." The line inched forward. Frank checked his watch too. 17 a.m. If he cleared the border by 3, he could make Phoenix by noon. The hospital bills wouldn't pay themselves, and this haul of automotive parts would cover next month's payment on Rose's cancer treatments. 5 years gone, and still, he was paying. But he'd promised her the best care. And Frank Dawson wasn't a man who broke promises. As Rosie's front bumper approached the inspection point, Frank noticed movement in his periphery. Two men had entered the customs building from opposite doors. Both moved with a particular economy of motion that drew Frank's attention despite their attempts to blend in. The first was older, with a weathered face beneath a baseball cap pulled low. He wore jeans, boots, and a plain button-up shirt, but carried himself with the squared shoulders of military training. The second wore dark glasses despite the hour, his long, dark coat out of place in the desert heat. His hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, his movements fluid and deliberate. Something about them prickled Frank's instincts, but before he could place why, the officer with the buzz cut was gesturing him forward, face arranged in what might have been a smile on another man. "Pull into Bay 3. Hale ordered, pointing to an inspection area separated from the main queue. Frank complied, easing Rosie into the designated spot with the precision of a man who'd spent more of his life behind a wheel than out of one. As he set the brake and reached for his papers, he caught the reflection of the officers in his side mirror, Hale's predatory grin, Riker's nervous energy. "Let's see what you've got, old-timer," Hale said, just loud enough for Frank to hear. In the fluorescent-lit waiting area, Chuck Norris folded his newspaper and watched the scene unfold through the scratched plexiglass windows. Beside him, a family with 3 sleepy children waited for processing, their belongings piled in neat stacks beside them. Across the room, Steven Seagal leaned against a vending machine, seemingly absorbed in his phone, but angled perfectly to observe both the exit and the inspection bays. Neither man acknowledged the other. They didn't need to. Both recognized what was about to happen. They'd seen it too many times before. A vulnerable traveler. Authorities drunk on petty power. The familiar dance of intimidation about to begin. Norris set his paper aside, his weathered face impassive beneath his cap. Seagull slipped his phone into his pocket, eyes hidden behind his dark glasses. Around them, the border station hummed with the late-night rhythm of bureaucracy and exhaustion, unaware that in the next hour, everything would change. Frank stepped down from Rosie's cab, the familiar ache in his right knee flaring as his boot hit the concrete. He'd broken that knee in '92, jackknifing on black ice outside Albuquerque to avoid a family of deer. The doctors had put him back together with pins and promises that he'd never drive long haul again. He'd proven them wrong within 6 months. License, registration, and cargo manifest. Hale demanded, hand outstretched. His badge read, Hale. 5. Beneath the silver shield that gleamed too brightly under the floodlights. Frank handed over his documents, each one dog-eared but meticulously maintained. "Hauling automotive parts for Jimenez Manufacturing," he explained, his gravelly voice barely carrying over the ambient hum of the border station. "Everything's in order." Hale made a show of flipping through the papers, his smirk never wavering. Beside him, Officer Riker paced the length of Rosie, slapping his palm with a flashlight. "Pretty old rig you got here," Riker called out, his voice pitched too high. "When's the last time she had a proper inspection?" "Passed dot inspection last month in Tucson," Frank answered, keeping his voice level. He dealt with men like these before, small men made temporarily large by uniform and circumstance. "Certificates with my papers." Hale's smile widened as he deliberately creased Frank's documents. "Well, we're not in Tucson now, are we? We'll need to conduct our own thorough inspection." Frank felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his stomach. In the waiting area beyond the inspection bay, travelers averted their eyes, their faces a catalog of sympathy and relief that they weren't the ones being singled out. Only the 2 strangers, the military man and the one with the ponytail, seemed to be watching with quiet intensity. "How about you open her up?" Hale said, his voice dropping to a silky threat. "And we'll see what old Rosie's really carrying tonight." The inspection bay's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Rosie's faded red paint as Frank unlocked the trailer doors. His hands gnarled from decades of work, moved with practiced efficiency despite the tremor he couldn't quite control. He'd crossed this border hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. The air was charged with something beyond the usual weariness of late-night crossings. Officer Hale slammed Frank's paperwork down on Rosie's hood, spreading the pages carelessly. "Got some irregularities here, old-timer," he announced, loud enough for the small crowd of onlookers to hear. Frank's jaw tightened. "No, sir. Those papers are in order." "Is that right?" Hale's voice dripped with mock surprise. "You calling me a liar?" Before Frank could respond, Officer Riker emerged from the trailer, flashlight beam dancing erratically across the neatly secured pallets of automotive parts. "Everything matches the manifest," he reported, a note of disappointment in his voice. Hale's smile didn't falter. "The manifest might be accurate, but I'm seeing problems with your logbook, Dawson. Looks like you've exceeded your hours." Frank's weathered face remained impassive, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "That's not possible. I followed regulations to the letter." "Oh? Well, maybe my math is off." Hale tapped his temple. "Maybe we could clear this up with a processing fee. Save us both some paperwork." The implication hung in the air between them. In the waiting area, a mother pulled her children closer, turning their faces away from the scene. A businessman buried himself deeper in his newspaper. Only the two strangers, still unmoving, still watching, seemed willing to witness what was happening. "I don't have that kind of cash," Frank said, his raspy voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "And I know my rights." Hale's smile vanished. "Rights? Let me tell you about rights." He stepped closer, using his height to loom over Frank. "I have the right to impound this piece of junk if I deem it unsafe. I have the right to detain you for further questioning. I have the right to make your night very, very long." Riker circled Rosie, his flashlight beam searching for infractions. "Tread on these tires is looking pretty worn, Hale," he called out, his voice eager to please. "And there's a crack in the passenger side mirror." "Sounds serious," Hale said, never taking his eyes off Frank. "Unsafe vehicle operation is a hefty fine. Could mean impound." Frank felt his throat tighten. Rosie wasn't just transportation. She was the last tangible connection to his wife, to the life they'd built together. Her name was stenciled inside the cab, along with a faded photograph of Rose smiling from the passenger seat during their cross-country anniversary trip. The thought of Rosie in an impound lot, stripped for parts or left to rust, made his hands curl into fists at his sides. "How much?" The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Hale pretended to consider. "Well, there's the logbook violation, the unsafe equipment. I'd say $500 would cover it. Cash, of course." $500 was more than half of what Frank would clear on this run after fuel and tolls. It was medication money, mortgage money, but the alternative was losing Rosie altogether. "I have 300, Frank said, the admission burning like bile. 300? Hale laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "That might have covered it an hour ago, but now I'm thinking the violations are more serious." The price just went up to 700. In the waiting area, the tension thickened. A few travelers had begun filming discreetly with their phones, though none dared intervene. The stranger in the baseball cap had set down his coffee, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. The man with the ponytail had removed his dark glasses, his eyes narrowed as he absorbed every detail of the confrontation. "This is highway robbery," Frank said, his gravelly voice rising despite himself. "I want to speak to your supervisor." Hale's response was to grab Frank's logbook from the cab, flipping through it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Supervisor's not on duty till morning," he said. "But I'm sure he'd be very interested in these discrepancies I'm finding." Very interested indeed. Riker had begun opening Rosie's storage compartments without permission, emptying the contents onto the concrete floor tools, spare parts, the small duffel bag containing Frank's personal belongings. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a small wooden box. Frank's heart stuttered. "That's personal. It's not contraband." Riker opened it anyway, revealing a simple gold wedding band nestled on faded velvet. Rose's ring. Frank kept it with him always, a talisman of sorts. Sometimes, on the loneliest stretches of highway, he would talk to it as if Rose could hear him through the gold circle she'd worn for 37 years. "Sentimental value only," Riker said, disappointment evident in his voice. Hale snatched the box. "Might cover part of your fine, though." Something shifted in Frank then, a plate. Tectonic movement beneath the weathered landscape of his patience. "That belonged to my wife," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "You will not take it." "Or what, old man?" Hale stepped closer, using his body to back Frank against Rosie's side. "You going to stop me? You going to hit an officer? Because that would make my night." The crowd had grown, drawn by the escalating tension. Some whispered among themselves. Others filmed more openly now. The border station's regular rhythms had slowed, as everyone, officers and travelers alike, sensed the situation balancing on a knife's edge. Hale pressed his advantage, knowing he had an audience. "Here's how this plays out, Dawson. You pay the fine, all 700 now, or Rosie here gets impounded. And you? You can wait in a holding cell while we process the paperwork. Might take hours. Might take days." Frank stood his ground, though everything in him screamed to back down. Rose's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. "Sometimes standing up is all we can do, even when we can't win." "I will not be extorted," Frank said, each word distinct, despite his raspy voice. "Not by you. Not by anyone wearing that badge." Hale's face darkened. "Wrong answer." He nodded to Riker, who produced a set of handcuffs. "Frank Dawson, you're being detained for further questioning regarding possible customs violations." Frank didn't resist as Riker approached with the cuffs. Though every muscle in his body coiled with the instinct to fight, he was too old, too smart, and too tired to give these men the excuse they wanted. But as Riker reached for his wrist, a calm voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem here, officers?" All heads turned toward the source, the stranger in the baseball cap, now standing at the edge of the inspection bay. His question was mild. His posture relaxed. But something in his presence caused Riker to hesitate. The handcuffs suddenly heavy in his hands. Hale recovered quickly. "This is a restricted area, sir. Return to the waiting room immediately." The stranger didn't move. "I asked if there was a problem." "This is none of your concern," Hale snapped, his hand drifting toward his holster in an unconscious tell. "Official Border Patrol business." "Looks like harassment to me," came another voice, the man with the ponytail, now positioned on the opposite side of the bay, effectively flanking the officers. He moved with liquid grace despite his size, his eyes never leaving Hale's face. Around them, phones recorded, voices murmured. And in the center of it all, Frank Dawson stood with his back against Rosie, watching as the balance of power began its subtle shift. The stranger in the baseball cap took another step forward, his movements measured and deliberate. The harsh fluorescent lights caught his features as he tilted his head up, weathered skin, penetrating eyes that had seen too much, the unmistakable profile of Chuck Norris. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A ripple passed through the onlookers. Phones raised higher, recording with renewed interest. Someone whispered his name, the sound spreading like wind through dry grass. Across the inspection bay, Steven Seagal removed his dark glasses completely, tucking them into his coat pocket with unhurried precision. His gaze remained fixed on Officer Riker, who had begun to fidget with the handcuffs, suddenly uncertain. "This man," Norris said, nodding toward Frank, "appears to be complying with all reasonable requests. I'm curious what justifies the handcuffs." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried an unmistakable weight. This wasn't a man who needed volume to command attention. Hale's face flushed, a combination of anger and the dawning recognition of who had interrupted his shakedown. "This is a border security matter," he insisted, falling back on official language. "We have reason to believe." "What reason?" Seagal interrupted, his deep voice flowing like molten metal. "His paperwork looks complete from where I'm standing. His truck contains exactly what the manifest lists." Hale's jaw tightened. "And who exactly are you to make that assessment?" Seagal's smile was thin and dangerous. "Just an observer with some experience in these matters." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the unmistakable presence of the two action stars. Tourists and truckers alike pressed closer, some openly recording, others nudging each other in disbelief. A young mother lifted her child for a better view, whispering explanations in rapid Spanish. Frank remained silent, watching the scene unfold with the patient assessment of a man who had learned when to speak and when to wait. His eyes darted between Norris and Seagal, recognizing them, certainly, but more importantly, recognizing what they represented in this moment: a counterweight to unchecked authority. Riker took a half-step back, the handcuffs now hanging limply from his fingers. "Maybe we should call this in," he suggested to Hale, his voice pitched low, but carrying in the tense silence. "We don't need to call anything in," Hale snapped, doubling down despite the changing dynamics. "What we need is for civilians to stay out of official business." He turned to the gathering crowd, raising his voice. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately. This is a restricted area." No one moved. Norris folded his arms across his chest, the gesture casual but somehow transforming his presence from observer to participant. "Seems to me," he said, his Texas drawl more pronounced now, "that if this were legitimate official business, you wouldn't mind witnesses." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Seagal had begun a slow circuit of Rosie, his eyes taking in the scattered contents of Frank's storage compartments, the open trailer, the inspection that had morphed into intimidation. $700 seems like an unusual fine," he remarked, "especially when paid directly to the officers rather than through official channels." The implication hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. Hale's hand moved to his holster again, this time with deliberate intent. "I'm ordering everyone to step back. Now." "Or what?" Norris asked, his voice still calm, his posture still relaxed. "You'll draw your weapon? In front of all these cameras? That would be unwise." The standoff stretched, second by excruciating second. Frank could feel Rosie's metal warming against his back, could hear the soft ticking of her cooling engine. Around them, the border station had transformed from a place of routine crossing to the stage for something unprecedented. A younger officer, not Riker, someone from the main checkpoint, had noticed the commotion and approached cautiously. "Everything okay over here?" Hale didn't take his eyes off Norris. "Fine. Just dealing with a non-compliant driver." "Doesn't look non-compliant to me," the young officer observed, taking in the scene with growing concern. "Looks like an ordinary inspection that's gotten out of hand." Riker seized the opportunity for extraction. "Maybe we should let Mr. Dawson go with a warning this time," he suggested, desperately trying to navigate a path out of the situation. Hale shot him, a look of pure venom. Nobody's getting warnings tonight. In the waiting area, someone had recognized Seaga and Norris for certain now. The whispers had become excited murmurs, phones were dialing, social media updating in real time. Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal facing off with corrupt border agents. The story was already writing itself in digital space, spreading beyond the confines of this remote crossing. Frank finally spoke, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. My papers are in order. My cargo is legitimate. I've violated no laws. He straightened up, no longer leaning against Rosie but standing on his own strength. These officers demanded a cash payment to let me through. When I refused, they threatened to impound my truck and detain me. His simple statement, delivered without drama or embellishment, landed with the weight of absolute truth. The young officer looked to Hale, then to Riker. Uncertainty clear on his face. Is that true? Of course not. Hale snarled. The old man is confused. Possibly intoxicated. We were about to administer a sobriety test when these civilians interfered. Norris raised an eyebrow. Interesting. I've been watching for 20 minutes, and this is the first mention of sobriety. And those cameras, Seagal added, pointing to the security system mounted above the inspection bay, will have recorded the entire interaction, including the demand for $700 in cash. Something flickered across Hale's face, the first hint of genuine concern. The security footage would indeed show everything, assuming it was reviewed. Assuming someone cared enough to check, Riker had begun to sweat visibly, his earlier eagerness replaced by the dawning realization that he'd aligned himself with the wrong side. Victor, he muttered. Maybe we should. Shut up, Hale hissed. Then, louder, to the gathering crowd. This is your final warning. Disperse now, or face obstruction charges. No one moved. If anything, the circle tightened. In the strange alchemy of crowd dynamics, something had shifted fundamentally. What had begun as casual observation had crystallized into collective witness. These people, strangers to each other and to Frank, had become unified in their silent refusal to look away. Their presence was no longer passive, it was a declaration. Norris took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Hale. Nothing in his movement suggested aggression, yet the air around him seemed to compress with potential energy. Here's what's going to happen, he said. His voice pitched for Hale alone, though everyone strained to hear. You're going to return Mr. Dawson's property, all of it, including his wife's ring. You're going to apologize for the misunderstanding. And then you're going to let him continue on his way. Hale's laugh was harsh. Or what? You'll karate chop me? This isn't one of your movies, Norris. No, Norris agreed. It's not. In movies, there are scripts and second takes. This, he gestured to the phone's recording, the security cameras overhead, the gathered witnesses, is reality. And in reality, actions have consequences. Siegel had completed his circuit of the truck and now stood behind Riker, close enough that the younger officer could feel his presence like heat from a fire. The choice is simple, Seagal said. D. Escalate now. Or explain later why a routine inspection required physical force against a compliant driver. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Frank watched it unfold with the stoic patience of a man who had weathered too many storms to be rattled by one more. Beside him, Rosie's metal ticked as it cooled, the sound like a clock counting down to an inevitable conclusion. The tipping point came with a gesture. Hale, cornered and furious, grabbed Frank's arm. You're coming with me, he growled, yanking the older man toward him with unnecessary force. Obstruction, resisting, and whatever else I can make stick. Frank stumbled, his bad knee buckling under the sudden movement. He caught himself against Rosie's side, pain flashing across his weathered face. It was the only provocation needed. Chuck Norris moved with the fluid precision of muscle memory honed over decades of discipline. One moment he was standing at a respectful distance. The next, his hand was on Hale's wrist, applying precise pressure to the nerve point that sent electric pain shooting up the officer's arm. "That's enough," Norris said, his voice still calm despite the escalation. Hale's grip on Frank released involuntarily as his fingers spasmed. "You're assaulting an officer," he snarled, though the threat in his voice was undercut by the surprise in his eyes. "That's a federal offense." "I'm preventing an officer from assaulting a citizen," Norris corrected, maintaining the pressure point hold. "And I haven't begun to assault you." On the other side of the inspection bay, Riker reached for his weapon, a panicked reaction rather than a considered choice. Before his hand could close around the grip, Seaga was behind him, one arm snaking around Riker's to lock his elbow in a painful hyperextension. "Bad idea," Seaga murmured, his breath warm against Riker's ear. "Very bad idea." The crowd gasped collectively, phones raised higher to capture what was happening. The young officer who had approached earlier backed away, torn between duty to his colleagues and the clear evidence that something corrupt had been interrupted. Hale tried to twist out of Norris's grip, reaching for his own weapon with his free hand. Norris simply adjusted his hold, using Hale's momentum against him to spin the officer around and pin his arm behind his back in one smooth motion. "You have two choices," Norris said, his voice pitched low enough that only Hale could hear the words clearly. "You can escalate this and lose everything: your badge, your freedom, your reputation. Or you can walk away with a lesson learned and your dignity somewhat intact." Across the bay, Seaga had similarly immobilized Riker with minimal apparent effort. The younger officer's face was flushed with a combination of pain and humiliation as he found himself helpless in the grip of a man who seemed to exert no strain at all. "Let me go. You Hollywood has been..." Hale spat, struggling against Norris's hold. The insult rolled off Norris like water from stone. "Pride makes a poor counselor in moments like these," he observed, adjusting his grip slightly to emphasize his point. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The onlookers had fallen silent, collective breath held as they witnessed power dynamics shifting in real time. Frank had straightened up, favoring his good leg, watching with the quiet assessment of a man who had seen his share of confrontations but few resolutions like this one. It was Frank who broke the silence, his gravelly voice carrying across the inspection bay. "I don't want trouble. I just want to continue my delivery." There was no fear in his voice, only the weariness of a man who had faced too many small injustices to be surprised by one more, or by its unexpected resolution. Norris nodded without releasing Hale. A reasonable request. More Border Patrol officers had begun to gather at the edges of the scene, drawn by the commotion. They held back, uncertain how to proceed as they assessed the bizarre tableau. Two of their colleagues immobilized by men most of them had only seen on movie screens. A senior officer pushed through the crowd, the bars on his uniform marking him as someone with actual authority. "What the hell is going on here?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then a dozen voices rose at once, travelers who had witnessed the entire confrontation from the beginning, eager to report what they'd seen. These officers were demanding cash. They threatened to impound his truck. They were going to arrest him for nothing. "I recorded the whole thing." The senior officer raised his hands. Silence. His expression grim as he surveyed the scene. His gaze lingered on the scattered contents of Frank's storage compartments, the open logbook with pages bent from Hale's handling, the small wooden box containing Rose's ring lying open on the concrete. "Release my officers," he ordered Norris and Seaga, his tone making it clear he expected to be obeyed. Norris assessed the man for a long moment, then nodded slightly. He released Hale with the same controlled precision he'd used to restrain him, stepping back to a neutral distance. Across the bay, Seagal did the same with Riker, the younger officer immediately rubbing his arm where the joint lock had been applied. "These men assaulted us," Hale said immediately, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "I want them arrested." The senior officer ignored him, turning instead to Frank. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Frank straightened his jacket, dignity returning to his posture now that the immediate threat had passed. "I was pulled into inspection. My papers are in order. My cargo matches the manifest. These officers," he nodded toward Hale and Riker, "claim to find violations that don't exist and demanded cash payment to let me through. When I refused, they threatened to impound my truck and detain me." "That's a lie," Hale cut in. "He was belligerent from the start, possibly intoxicated." The senior officer turned to the crowd. "Did anyone record this interaction from the beginning?" At least 20 phones were raised in response. "I got it all," a young woman said, stepping forward with her phone already queued up, from when they first pulled him over. The senior officer took the phone, watching the footage with an increasingly grim expression. The video clearly showed Hale's initial approach, the inspection that turned aggressive, the demand for cash, the threat of impoundment. When he looked up, his face had hardened into something unreadable. "Hale. Riker. Wait in my office." His tone left no room for argument. Hale's face twisted with disbelief. "You're taking their side? After they assaulted officers in the performance of their duties?" "I'm not taking anyone's side yet," the senior officer replied. "But what I just watched doesn't look like proper procedure to me." Hale opened his mouth to protest further, but the senior officer cut him off with a sharp gesture. "My office. Now. Don't make me say it again." Riker, who had remained unusually silent since his release, nodded quickly and began walking toward the administrative building. After a moment of tense defiance, Hale followed, though not without a venomous backward glance at Norris and Seagal. As they departed, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the crowd. The immediate danger had passed, though the energy in the air remained charged. The senior officer turned to Frank. "Sir, I apologize for any inappropriate treatment you may have received. If you'll allow me, I'd like to review your paperwork myself and get you on your way as quickly as possible." Frank nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I'd appreciate that." As the senior officer began a proper, professional inspection, the onlookers gradually dispersed, though many lingered at a distance, still watching the unusual scene unfold. Social media was already alight with video clips and eyewitness accounts, the story spreading far beyond the remote border station. Norris bent down to retrieve the wooden box containing Rose's ring, closing it carefully before handing it back to Frank. "This is yours, I believe." Frank's gnarled fingers closed around the box, a flash of emotion crossing his face before his stoic mask returned. "Thank you," he said simply, though the words carried the weight of something far deeper. Seagal had begun helping gather Frank's scattered belongings, returning tools and personal items to their proper storage compartments with surprising care. "Nice rig," he commented, running an appreciative hand along Rosie's fender. "She's been good to me," Frank replied, the affection in his voice unmistakable. The three men worked in companionable silence, restoring order to what had been chaos just moments before. Around them, the border station gradually resumed its normal rhythms, though an undercurrent of excitement remained as the story of what had happened continued to spread. When Frank's belongings were secured and the senior officer had completed his inspection, Finding everything in perfect order, Norris and Seaga stepped back. They had said little throughout the confrontation, letting their actions speak for them. Now, as Frank prepared to continue his journey, there seemed little left to say. Frank paused before climbing back into Rosie's cab, turning to face the two men who had intervened on his behalf. "I don't know why you stepped in," he said, his gravelly voice thick with emotion he wouldn't name. "But I'm grateful you did." Norris shrugged, the gesture somehow containing both modesty and certainty. "Some things need to be done. And some people need to be reminded of the difference between power and strength," Seaga added, his usual intensity softened by something like compassion. Frank nodded, understanding the distinction without needing elaboration. He extended his weathered hand, first to Norris, then to Seaga, the handshakes brief but firm. No further words were needed. Frank climbed into Rosie's cab, the familiar seat conforming to his body as it had for decades. He started the engine, her diesel heart rumbling to life beneath him. Through the windshield, he could see Norris and Seaga watching, their expressions unreadable in the harsh floodlights. Frank released the brake and eased Rosie forward, continuing the journey that had been interrupted. In his rearview mirror, the border crossing receded, the floodlights growing dimmer, until they were just pinpricks in the vast desert night. Beside him on the passenger seat, the small wooden box containing Rose's ring caught the moonlight filtering through Rosie's windshield, a reminder that sometimes justice came from unexpected quarters. The tipping point came without warning, the fragile equilibrium shattering in a heartbeat. Hale, cornered and furious, grabbed Frank's arm with brutal force. "You're coming with me," he growled, yanking the older man forward. "Obstruction. Resisting. And whatever else I can make stick." Frank stumbled, his bad knee buckling beneath him. Pain flashed across his weathered face as he caught himself against Rosie's side, his calloused palm slapping against the familiar metal. The wedding ring box tumbled from his pocket, clattering across the concrete inspection bay. Norris moved with liquid precision, decades of discipline manifesting in a single fluid motion. One moment he stood at a respectful distance, the next, his hand locked around Hale's wrist, applying precise pressure to the nerve point that sent electric pain shooting up the officer's arm. "That's enough," Norris said, his voice still calm despite the escalation. Nothing in his tone suggested threat or rage, only absolute certainty. Hale's grip on Frank released involuntarily as his fingers spasmed. "You're assaulting an officer," he snarled, though the threat in his voice was undercut by the surprise in his eyes. "That's a federal offense." "I'm preventing an officer from assaulting a citizen," Norris corrected, maintaining the pressure point hold with practiced ease. "And I haven't begun to assault you." Across the inspection bay, Riker's hand twitched toward his holster, a reflexive movement, born of panic rather than courage. Before his fingers could close around the grip, Seaga materialized behind him like a shadow gaining substance. One arm snaked around Riker's, locking his elbow in a painful hyperextension while the other hand clamped around the officer's wrist, immobilizing it inches from his weapon. "Bad idea?" Seaga murmured, his breath warm against Riker's ear. "Very bad idea." The crowd gasped collectively. Phones raised higher to capture the confrontation. Some backed away, fearing escalation. Others pressed closer, unwilling to miss what was unfolding. The young officer who had approached earlier retreated several steps, torn between duty to his colleagues and the clear evidence of corruption exposed. In the charged silence, Frank straightened slowly, favoring his good leg. His eyes found the wooden box containing Rose's ring, now lying open on the concrete, the gold band catching the harsh fluorescent light. Something shifted in his expression, not anger but a deeper resolve, as if seeing his wife's ring threatened had crystallized his determination. Hale twisted violently, attempting to break Norris's hold through sheer strength and fury. Norris adjusted seamlessly, using Hale's own momentum to spin him around and pin his arm behind his back in one elegant motion that looked effortless, despite the officer's considerable size advantage. "You have two choices," Norris said. His voice pitched low enough that only Hale could hear the words clearly. "You can escalate this and lose everything: your badge, your freedom, your reputation. Or you can walk away with a lesson learned and your dignity somewhat intact." Sweat beaded on Hale's forehead as he strained against the hold, his face flushing deeper with each failed attempt to break free. "Let me go. You Hollywood has been," he spat, the insult revealing the desperation beneath his bravado. Norris didn't respond to the provocation. His expression remained impassive, his breathing steady and controlled. He simply adjusted his grip slightly, applying incrementally more pressure to emphasize his point without causing permanent damage. Across the bay, Riker had gone completely still in Seagal's hold, instinctively understanding that resistance would only increase his discomfort. His face had drained of color, humiliation burning in his eyes as he found himself helpless in the grip of a man who seemed to exert no strain at all. "You don't understand," Riker gasped, pain evident in his voice. "We were just doing our job." "No," Seagal replied, his tone oddly gentle despite the circumstances. "You were abusing your job. There's a difference." The standoff stretched, second by excruciating second. The air in the inspection bay felt charged with potential energy, a storm system hovering on the edge of breaking. Frank had managed to retrieve Rose's ring, closing the wooden box with reverent care before tucking it securely back into his pocket. He watched the scene unfold with the quiet assessment of a man who had witnessed too many confrontations to be easily rattled. "I don't want trouble," Frank said finally, his gravelly voice carrying across the silent bay. "I just want to continue my delivery." The simple statement, delivered without drama or embellishment, landed with the weight of absolute truth. Here was a man who asked for nothing more than to be allowed to do his job with dignity. The contrast between his humble request and the officer's outsized aggression could not have been starker. More Border Patrol agents had begun to gather at the periphery of the scene, drawn by the unusual commotion. They hung back, uncertain how to proceed as they assessed the bizarre tableau. Two of their colleagues immobilized by men, most of them recognized immediately from countless action films. A senior officer pushed through the growing crowd, the silver bars on his uniform marking him as someone with actual authority. Captain Reynolds, according to his nameplate, surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes, taking in every detail before speaking. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a dozen voices rose at once. Travelers who had witnessed the entire confrontation from the beginning, each eager to report what they'd seen. These officers were demanding cash. They threatened to impound his truck. They were going to arrest him for nothing. "I recorded the whole thing." Reynolds raised his hands for silence, his expression growing grimmer as he surveyed the inspection bay. His gaze lingered on the scattered contents of Frank's storage compartments, the open logbook with pages bent from Hale's handling, and the palpable tension between his officers and the two unexpected celebrities. "Release my officers," he ordered Norris and Seagal, his tone making it clear he expected to be obeyed. Norris assessed the man for a long moment, recognizing the integrity in his bearing. He nodded slightly, releasing Hale with the same controlled precision he'd used to restrain him, stepping back to a neutral distance. Across the bay, Seagal did the same with Riker, the younger officer immediately rubbing his arm where the joint lock had been applied. "These men assaulted us," Hale said immediately, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "I want them arrested." Reynolds ignored him, turning instead to Frank. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Frank straightened his jacket, dignity returning to his posture now that the immediate threat had passed. "I was pulled into inspection. My papers are in order. My cargo matches the manifest. These officers," he nodded toward Hale and Riker, "claimed to find violations that don't exist and demanded cash payment to let me through. When I refused, they threatened to impound my truck and detain me." "That's a lie," Hale cut in, his voice rising. He was belligerent from the start, possibly intoxicated. Frank's weathered face remained impassive, though a flicker of something, perhaps sadness, rather than anger, passed through his eyes. "I haven't touched alcohol since my wife passed 5 years ago." The quiet dignity in his statement silenced Hale more effectively than any shouted denial could have. Around them, the crowd had grown, phones recording every moment of the confrontation's aftermath. Social media was already alight with videos of the initial altercation, spreading far beyond the remote border station. Reynolds turned to the onlookers. "Did anyone record this interaction from the beginning?" At least 20 phones were raised in response. "I got it all," a young woman said, stepping forward with her phone already queued up. From when they first pulled him over, Reynolds took the phone, watching the footage with an increasingly grim expression. The video clearly showed Hale's initial approach, the inspection that turned aggressive, the demand for cash, the threat of impoundment. When he looked up, his face had hardened into something unreadable. "Hale. Riker. Wait in my office." His tone left no room for argument. Hale's face twisted with disbelief. Ah, you're taking their side? After they assaulted officers in the performance of their duties?" "I'm not taking anyone's side yet," Reynolds replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "But what I just watched doesn't look like proper procedure to me." "This is bullshit," Hale exploded, fists clenched at his sides. "You know how it works out here, Reynolds. Everyone does it." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd at this inadvertent admission. Reynolds's expression darkened further. "My office," he repeated. "Now, don't make me say it again." Riker, who had remained unusually silent since his release, nodded quickly and began walking toward the administrative building. After a moment of tense defiance, Hale followed, though not without a venomous backward glance at Norris and Seaga. As they departed, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the onlookers. The immediate danger had passed, though the energy in the air remained charged with the aftermath of confrontation. Reynolds turned back to Frank, genuine regret evident in his expression. "Sir, I apologize for any inappropriate treatment you may have received. If you'll allow me, I'd like to review your paperwork myself and get you on your way as quickly as possible." Frank nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I'd appreciate that." As Reynolds began a proper, professional inspection, the onlookers gradually dispersed, though many lingered at a distance, still recording the unusual scene. Social media was already alight with video clips and eyewitness accounts, the story spreading far beyond the remote border station. Norris bent down to retrieve a wrench that had fallen from Frank's toolkit during the confrontation, examining it with appreciation before returning it to its proper place. "Good quality," he commented. "They don't make them like this anymore." Frank accepted the tool with a nod. "Had that one since '89. Still works better than the new ones." The simple exchange, mundane in any other context, carried a weight of mutual respect between men who understood the value of reliability over flash. Seaga had begun helping gather Frank's scattered belongings, returning tools and personal items to their proper storage compartments with surprising care. "Nice rig," Seaga commented, running an appreciative hand along Rosie's fender. Classic Peterbilt. Solid engineering. She's been good to me, Frank replied, the affection in his voice unmistakable. Named her after my wife, Rose. Seaga nodded, understanding the sentiment without needing elaboration. Good name for a loyal companion. The three men worked in companionable silence, restoring order to what had been chaos just moments before. Around them, the border station gradually resumed its normal rhythms, though an undercurrent of excitement remained as the story of what had happened continued to spread. A family that had been waiting in line during the confrontation approached cautiously, the father ushering his young son forward. The boy, no more than 10, looked up at Norris with undisguised awe. "Are you really Chuck Norris?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Norris knelt to meet the boy at eye level, his smile genuine. "I am. What's your name?" "Miguel," the boy replied, gaining confidence. "I saw what you did. You didn't even have to hit that bad man." Norris nodded seriously. The strongest person in a fight is the one who doesn't need to throw a punch. Miguel considered this, his young face solemn with concentration. "But you could have, right? If you needed to?" "I could have," Norris agreed. "But that's not the point of knowing how to fight. The point is knowing when not to." The boy's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing him what real strength looks like." Norris straightened, accepting the thanks with a modest nod before the family moved on. Across the inspection bay, Seaga was having a similar interaction with a group of truckers who had witnessed the confrontation. His responses were briefer than Norris's, his demeanor more reserved. But the respect in his bearing was evident to all. Frank watched these interactions with quiet interest, noting how neither man seemed to revel in the attention or inflate their role in what had happened. There was no grandstanding, no playing to the crowd, just the same quiet competence they had displayed during the confrontation itself. When Reynolds returned with Frank's paperwork, everything was in perfect order. "You're clear to proceed, Mr. Dawson," he said, handing over the documents. "Again, I apologize for the delay and the unprofessional treatment." Frank accepted the papers with a nod. "Appreciate it. And as for you two," Reynolds turned to Norris and Seaga, "I should probably cite you for interfering with an official operation." A tense silence fell over the inspection bay. "But I won't," Reynolds continued, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Sometimes justice needs a helping hand, even if that hand technically doesn't have jurisdiction." Norris extended his hand, which Reynolds shook with firm respect. "Just happened to be in the right place." "Funny how that works," Reynolds observed dryly, shaking Seagal's hand as well. "I'll be reviewing our procedures after this. Clearly there are some gaps in oversight that need addressing." As Reynolds departed to deal with Hale and Riker, Frank prepared to continue his journey. He climbed into Rosie's cab, the familiar seat conforming to his body as it had for decades. Through the windshield, he could see Norris and Seaga standing side by side, an unlikely pair united briefly by circumstance and shared principle. Frank rolled down his window, leaning out slightly. "I don't know why you stepped in," he said, his gravelly voice carrying across the quiet inspection bay. "But I'm grateful you did." Norris shrugged, the gesture somehow containing both modesty and certainty. "Some things need to be done, and some people need to be reminded of the difference between power and strength," Seaga added, his usual intensity softened by something like compassion. Frank nodded, understanding the distinction without needing elaboration. He extended his weathered hand, first to Norris, then to Seaga. The handshakes brief but firm, A wordless exchange between men who recognized in each other something essential and increasingly rare. No further words were needed. Frank started Rosie's engine, her diesel heart rumbling to life beneath him. He released the brake and eased the truck forward, continuing the journey that had been interrupted. In his rearview mirror, he could see Norris and Seaga watching, their expressions unreadable in the harsh floodlights of the border crossing. As he pulled onto the highway, Frank touched his breast pocket where Rose's ring rested in its wooden box. "You were right, old girl," he murmured, though there was no one to hear. "There are still good people in the world." Behind him, the border station receded into the darkness, the confrontation already transforming into story videos being shared, witnesses recounting what they'd seen, social media buzzing with clips of the moment when two action stars stepped out of the screen and into real life. But for Frank, it was simpler than that. It wasn't about celebrities or viral moments. It was about something more fundamental: the quiet dignity of standing your ground, and the unexpected allies who sometimes appear when you least expect them. As Rosie's headlights cut through the desert night, Frank settled into the rhythm of the road that had been his constant companion for over 4 decades. Whatever happened back at the border would soon become another story in a life filled with them. A tale to tell, perhaps, but not one to dwell on. The highway stretched before him, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. Frank checked his mirrors one last time, noting that the border crossing had vanished from view, swallowed by the night and distance. Ahead lay Phoenix, and after that, wherever the road took him. He patted Rosie's dashboard affectionately. "Just you and me again, girl," he said, his gravelly voice barely audible above the engine's rumble. "Just the way we like it." And with that, Frank, Gravel, Dawson, continued his journey, leaving behind the brief intersection with fame, carrying with him only what mattered: his dignity, his purpose, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected forms. Dawn broke over the desert in ribbons of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost sacred. The jagged silhouettes of distant mountains softened in the morning light, and the vast emptiness that had seemed threatening in darkness revealed its austere beauty. Frank guided Rosie into a truck stop just outside Phoenix, her engine ticking over as he eased her into a parking space near the back of the lot, away from the busier sections. He'd driven through the night, pushing against exhaustion, determined to make his delivery on time, despite the delay at the border. His eyes burned from the long hours of focus, and his bad knee had stiffened to the point where he knew the first steps out of the cab would be agony. Still, there was satisfaction in having covered the distance, in having overcome. The truck stop hummed with early morning activity, other drivers fueling up or grabbing breakfast before the day's haul, mechanics beginning their shifts with coffee-warmed hands, the constant flow of vehicles arriving and departing. Frank sat motionless for a moment after cutting Rosie's engine, his weathered hands still resting on the wheel as he gathered his strength for the final leg of his journey. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unusual occurrence at this hour. Few people had his number, and fewer still would call before 7 in the morning. He pulled it out, squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen before answering with a cautious, "Dawson." "Mr. Dawson? This is Captain Reynolds from the border crossing last night." Frank straightened in his seat, instantly alert. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" "Nothing," Reynolds replied, his voice tinged with something like respect. "I'm calling to inform you that Officers Hale and Riker have been suspended pending an investigation into their conduct. I wanted you to know that what happened to you won't be happening to anyone else, at least not at my station." Frank absorbed this information in silence, weighing the words and their implications. In his 43 years on the road, He'd encountered his share of corrupt officials, not many, but enough to recognize the pattern. Usually, nothing came of it. The powerful protected their own. "I appreciate the call," he said finally. "And the action. There's something else," Reynolds continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Several of the videos taken last night have gone viral. You might want to prepare yourself for some attention when people recognize you." Frank's brow furrowed, creating new tributaries in the well-worn riverbeds of his face. "Viral? I don't understand." "Social media," Reynolds explained. "The incident has been shared widely online. Chuck Norris and Seaga defend elderly trucker from corrupt border agents, that sort of thing. Your face is visible in some of the footage." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. "I'm not interested in attention, Captain. I just want to do my job." "I understand," Reynolds said, sympathy evident in his voice. "I just thought you should know. For what it's worth, the comments I've seen are overwhelmingly supportive of you." After ending the call, Frank sat in contemplative silence, watching the activity around him without really seeing it. The thought of becoming some kind of internet sensation was profoundly uncomfortable. He'd spent his life in the relative anonymity of the open road, finding freedom in being just another trucker moving goods across the vast American landscape. Visibility, in his experience, rarely brought anything good. He thought of Rose, who would have found the whole situation darkly funny. "Your 15 minutes of fame," she would have said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "And all you had to do was get harassed by the Border Patrol." The memory brought a slight smile to his lips, though it faded quickly into the familiar ache of her absence. With a resigned shake of his head, he eased himself out of Rosie's cab, wincing as his bad knee protested after the long night of driving. The air was cool but warming rapidly as the sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. Frank stretched carefully, working the stiffness from his body before heading toward the diner. He needed coffee and food before the final push to the delivery point. Inside, the truck stop diner buzzed with the particular energy of early morning, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the grill, the low murmur of conversations fueled by caffeine, and the anticipation of miles ahead. Frank settled into a booth by the window, ordering coffee and eggs from a waitress who looked as tired as he felt. He stirred sugar into his coffee, watching the crystals dissolve into the dark liquid. There was something meditative about the simple ritual. A brief moment of stillness in a life defined by constant motion. The diner's television, mounted in the corner, was tuned to a morning news program, the volume low enough that only snippets reached him. Frank paid it little attention until he heard the words "border incident" cut through the ambient noise. His head lifted, eyes fixing on the screen where footage from the previous night played in a loop. There he was, backed against Rosie's side, dignity intact, despite the clear intimidation. And there were Norris and Seaga, stepping in with quiet authority that required no explanation or amplification. The captions scrolling beneath the footage read, "Action stars intervene in Border Patrol incident, corruption allegations surface." Other drivers in the diner had noticed as well, heads turning from the television to Frank and back again as recognition dawned. A murmur spread through the room, the familiar quiet of the early morning disrupted by the unexpected celebrity in their midst. Frank kept his eyes on his coffee, discomfort evident in the set of his shoulders. He hadn't asked for any of this. Not the confrontation, not the intervention, and certainly not the attention that followed. He'd spent decades perfecting the art of blending in, of being forgettable enough that he could move through the world without friction. Now, suddenly, he was visible. A young driver from the next booth approached cautiously, cap in hand. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the trucker from the border crossing? The one with Chuck Norris and Seaga?" Frank looked up, meeting the young man's eager gaze with resigned acknowledgement. "I'm just a driver, trying to make a delivery," he said, his gravelly voice firm but not unkind. The young man nodded, respect evident in his expression. "My old man was a trucker too. 40 years on the road before his heart gave out. He always said the real heroes were the ones who just did their job without complaint. Day in and day out." He extended his hand. "I just wanted to say I'm glad those officers got what was coming to them. Too many folks with badges think they're above the law." Frank hesitated, then shook the offered hand. "Thank you," he said simply. As the young driver returned to his booth, Frank noticed others watching him with newfound interest. Some nodded respectfully. Others seemed to be working up the courage to approach. With a quiet sigh, he left money on the table for his barely touched breakfast and made his way back to Rosie, seeking the solitude of his cab. Once inside, he sat with the engine off, watching the sunrise complete its transformation of the desert. The wooden box containing Rose's ring rested in his palm, its familiar weight comforting after the strangeness of the past 12 hours. He opened it, looking at the simple gold band that had adorned her finger for 37 years. "What do you think, Rosie?" he asked aloud, addressing both his truck and the memory of his wife in the same breath. Should we be flattered or annoyed? The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unheard. Frank had long believed that Rose somehow traveled with him not as a ghost or spirit, but as a presence woven into the fabric of his daily existence. He felt her in Rosie's familiar vibrations, heard her in the engine's steady rhythm, sensed her in the quiet moments between destinations. Rose had always been the one who engaged with the world, talking easily with strangers at diners, remembering the names of waitresses from truck stops they visited only once a year, sending Christmas cards to mechanics who had helped them in various towns across the country. Frank had been content to exist in the warm circle of her outgoing nature, happy to let her be the bridge between him and the wider world. When cancer took her, it took that bridge as well, leaving him more isolated than he'd realized. "Guess I'll have to handle this one on my own," he murmured, closing the box and tucking it back into his breast pocket, close to his heart. With a decisive nod, he started Rosie's engine and pulled out of the truck stop. The delivery waited, and whatever strange fame had attached itself to him overnight didn't change the fundamental truth of his existence. He was a man with a job to do, a schedule to keep, and promises to honor. Across the country, in very different settings, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal were each dealing with the unexpected publicity in their own ways. Norris, having returned to his ranch in Texas, sat at his kitchen table reviewing emails from his publicist about the flood of interview requests. The incident had rekindled public interest in him, bringing renewed attention to his charity work and upcoming projects. He'd already declined most of the interviews, preferring to let the actions speak for themselves. His wife entered the kitchen, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Another moment of being Chuck Norris," she said, a smile in her voice. He covered her hand with his own, returning the smile. "Just happened to be in the right place." "You always seem to be," she observed, pouring coffee into his waiting cup. "When someone needs help." Norris shrugged, neither accepting nor rejecting the observation. It was the right thing to do. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the morning light spreading across their property. Finally, his wife spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "That old trucker, he reminded me of your father. Same kind of quiet dignity." Norris nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. His father had been a man of few words and steady principles, who believed that work itself was a kind of prayer when done with integrity. "Different generation," he said. "They don't make many like that anymore." "They made you," she replied simply, squeezing his shoulder before moving to start breakfast. Norris returned to his emails, but his thoughts remained with Frank Dawson and the brief intersection of their lives. He hoped the older man was finding his way back to anonymity, back to the quiet dignity of work done well without an audience. In Los Angeles, Seaga was similarly fielding calls from his management team. The viral videos had sparked interest in a potential comeback film, with producers suddenly eager to capitalize on the renewed public attention. Unlike Norris, Seaga saw potential in the opportunity. Not for fame, he'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes, but for the platform it provided. He'd been working on environmental and humanitarian causes for years, often overshadowed by his earlier action persona. Perhaps this unexpected moment in the spotlight could be redirected toward those efforts. "Tell them I'm interested," he instructed his manager regarding one particular producer. "But the project would need to incorporate themes of justice and environmental protection, and I want a percentage donated to water conservation efforts." His manager sighed audibly over the phone. "Stephen, they're looking for an action film, not a message piece." "Then they're missing the point of what happened at that border crossing," Seaga replied, his voice firm. "It wasn't about the fight. It was about standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself." After ending the call, Seaga moved through the practiced forms of his morning Aikido routine, his body flowing through movements honed by decades of discipline. As his breathing synchronized with the deliberate gestures, his mind returned to the border crossing, to the moment when arrogance had collapsed in the face of quiet competence. There was a lesson there that went beyond the specifics of the confrontation. Something about the nature of true strength versus the illusion of power. Back at the border crossing, Captain Reynolds supervised the morning shift change with unusual attention to detail. The night's events had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not the confrontation itself, but the realization that corruption had flourished under his command without his knowledge. Or had he simply chosen not to see it? He'd spent the early hours reviewing complaint files, finding disturbing patterns that should have raised red flags months ago. Hale and Riker weren't the only officers with questionable practices, though they appeared to be the most blatant. A complete review of procedures was clearly needed, along with retraining for the entire staff. "Sir," a young officer approached, tablet in hand. "Internal Affairs is here. They're waiting in your office." Reynolds nodded, squaring his shoulders for what promised to be a difficult day. "Thank you, Officer Chen. And how are things at the crossing this morning?" "Smooth, sir. No incidents." "Let's keep it that way," Reynolds said, heading toward his office with renewed determination. The damage couldn't be undone, but it could be prevented from spreading further. The internal affairs investigation would be thorough and uncomfortable, but necessary. Reynolds had already decided that he would accept whatever consequences came his way for the failures of oversight. Leadership meant responsibility, not just authority. As he walked toward his office, Reynolds passed the inspection bay where the confrontation had occurred. In the harsh light of morning, it looked ordinary again. Just concrete and metal, and the tools of border security. But something had changed. Not in the physical space, but in how he perceived it. The border was not just a line to be defended. It was also a place where power could be abused if left unchecked. He paused, looking out at the line of vehicles waiting for morning processing. Among them were families, workers, travelers, all vulnerable in their own ways to the arbitrary exercise of authority. Reynolds made a silent promise to each of them that what had happened to Frank Dawson would not be repeated. Not on his watch. Not anymore. 3 days later, Frank completed his delivery and picked up a return load bound for El Paso. His brief moment of internet fame had mostly faded, though occasionally someone at a truck stop or weighing station would give him a second look of recognition. He'd received a formal letter of apology from the Border Patrol, along with assurances that the officers involved had been dealt with appropriately. An investigative journalist had left 3 messages on his rarely checked voicemail, seeking an interview about systemic issues at border crossings. Frank had deleted them without response. As he guided Rosie onto the interstate, heading west into the setting sun, his thoughts returned to the night that had briefly thrust him into an unexpected spotlight. Not to the confrontation or the humiliation, but to the moment afterward when he'd stood beside his truck, dignity restored, watching 2 men who embodied a particular kind of quiet strength walk away without seeking recognition or reward. That, Frank reflected, was the true lesson of the encounter. Not that justice sometimes arrived in unexpected forms, though that was certainly true, but that real strength, the kind that mattered, never needed to announce itself. It simply acted when action was required, then continued on its way without fanfare. He patted Rosie's dashboard affectionately. "You getting philosophical in your old age, Gravel?" he muttered to himself, a smile creasing his weathered face. The highway stretched before him, familiar and endless. Frank settled into the rhythm of the road. The wooden box containing Rose's ring secure in his pocket. Rosie's engine humming beneath him. Whatever brief intersection with fame had touched his life had already receded, leaving behind only the constants that had always sustained him. The work, the road, and the quiet dignity of a life lived on his own terms. As the miles passed beneath Rosie's wheels, Frank thought about the young man at the truck stop, whose father had been a trucker. There was something comforting in the continuity of it, the knowledge that even as the world changed, there would always be people who understood the value of steady work, done without expectation of recognition. He reached into his pocket, feeling the outline of Rose's ring box. He'd been carrying it for 5 years now, unable to part with it but unsure what to do with it. Perhaps it was time to think about that, about legacy and memory, and the things we leave behind. Miles behind him, the border crossing continued its ceaseless operation, changed in subtle but significant ways by what had transpired. New procedures were being implemented. Oversight increased. Corrupt practices rooted out one by one. Reynolds had committed himself to the task with the zeal of a man atoning for past blindness, determined that his station would become a model of integrity rather than a cautionary tale. And somewhere, in different parts of the country, Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal continued their separate journeys, neither seeking nor avoiding the brief renewal of public attention. They had acted according to their nature when circumstances required it, nothing more, nothing less. In the vast tapestry of interconnected lives, their paths had crossed briefly and significantly, then diverged again. No dramatic pronouncements, no lasting alliances, just the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes justice required nothing more than being present and willing to act when others would not. As twilight deepened into night, Frank switched on Rosie's headlights, illuminating the road ahead. Behind him, the wooden box containing Rose's ring rested securely in his pocket, a talisman of memory and purpose. Before him, the highway unspooled like a promise. Each mile, a reminder that every journey continues long after the moments that briefly define it. "Onward, Rosie," he murmured, his gravelly voice barely audible above the engine's steady rumble. "We've got miles to go." And in the quiet darkness of the cab, Frank could have sworn he heard Rose's gentle laughter in response, not a ghost or a memory, but the enduring presence of love that transcends even death. It was enough. It had always been enough. He reached forward and turned on the radio, finding an old country station playing Johnny Cash. "I Walk the Line" filled the cab, and Frank hummed along, his deep voice blending with Cash's as Rosie's tires ate up the miles. The truck rolled on through the night, one more set of taillights among many, carrying its cargo and its stories across the vast American landscape. In the distance, lightning flickered on the horizon, a summer storm brewing over the mountains. Frank checked his mirrors, adjusted his course slightly, and drove on. Some men sought the spotlight, craving recognition and acclaim. Others, like Hale, used their authority as a cudgel, mistaking fear for respect. But Frank Dawson had long ago discovered the quiet satisfaction of simply doing what needed to be done, day after day, mile after mile. It wasn't glamorous. It rarely made headlines. But in its own way, it was a kind of heroism, the steady persistence that kept the world turning, goods moving, promises kept. And sometimes, just sometimes, that quiet dignity drew the attention of others who recognized its worth. Not for long, perhaps, but long enough to remind us all that true strength doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It simply shows up when needed, does what must be done, and continues on its way. The highway stretched endlessly before him, disappearing into the darkness beyond Rosie's headlights. Frank Dawson drove on, carrying with him the memory of Rose, the lessons of the border crossing, and the quiet certainty that his journey was far from over. Just another trucker on the road. Just another hero hiding in plain sight. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.